Hello, class and professor. It's Natasha here. I am going to go over my final portfolio. Throughout my portfolio, I used the dependent variable sex education for the entire thing. However, I did change my independent variables throughout just based on the data that I found. So for week 1, my research question started out as, does favorability of sex education reduce the number of sexual partners per year in young people? And do males have more partners per year than females? I thought that these were important questions to ask because I really didn't understand the purpose of the course yet, and I really didn't understand what we were going to do with the variables. So that was the very beginning of my hypothesis. However, it did change quite a bit. As you can see, I have an outline in tables 1 and 2 of what the 2012 GSS outlined for each variable and the questions and responses that were asked and available. For week 2, we explored frequency tables and histograms. However, I did change my variables and my hypotheses because I did get advice from the professor and different students that my variables were too confusing and I should reduce it to one hypothesis. So my new hypothesis became younger people are more in favor of sex education in public schools than older people. Below are the frequency tables and histograms from the week 2 output. And table 3 shows the statistics of each of the variables. Basically, the mean is the average, the median is the middle, and the mode is the most, if that makes sense. So for this example, 48 is the average age of the respondent, 47 is the middle age of the respondent, and 30 is the most occurring age throughout the survey. Again, this shows the frequency of each age of person that took the test, and then this shows the frequency of people that favor and oppose sex education. These are histograms displaying the same thing, they're just illustrating exactly the same thing as the frequency tables. So for week 3, I did a cross-tabulation to understand the correlation of data between the variables sex education and age. Again, sex education is a dependent variable, age is independent variable. My hypothesis began as younger people are more in favor of sex education than older people, but as I did my hypothesis, as I did the cross-tabulation, I did change my hypothesis to older people oppose sex education in public schools more often than younger people. Through some trial and error, I came up with the null hypothesis. Older people favor sex education more often than younger people. And again, that goes to my first hypothesis because I did change it based off of the data that I found in the crosstab. So in table 6, the cross-tabulation of variables sex education and age, I found that 474 respondents age 40 and under were in favor of sex education, and 681 respondents age 41 and over were in favor of sex education. This made my first hypothesis untrue, so that's why I reformulated it to older people oppose sex education more frequently than younger people, because that hypothesis is true since 26 of the people that opposed sex education were 40 and younger, while 91 of them were 41 and older. As you can see with the numbers, it's pretty obvious why I changed my hypothesis. So that data analysis allows me to reject my null hypothesis that older people favor sex education more frequently than younger people. So for week 4, what we did for the course was find articles that related to our statistical analysis. So the articles that I chose were based on sex education programs and sex education favorability. The first one was a 94-item questionnaire that asked questions regarding different factors regarding sex education in public schools. So there were 1,036 respondents. Some of them answered the full questionnaire, and some of them were given phone interviews. Basically, the findings were that 70% of respondents agreed that sex education that emphasizes abstinence but includes contraceptive information decreases pregnancy and disease. So this is important because it also relates to the favorability, because if people believe that, then it is common that they will favor sex education. In the phone interview, they were asked the question, do you support sex education twice, once at the beginning and once at the end? In the beginning, 75% of respondents said yes, and at the end, 81 respondents said yes. This shows that favorability increased as the respondents' knowledge on the subject increased. This was important for my study because it adds in the factor of education and knowledge surrounding the response choices and the background to the question itself. So for the second article that I chose, it was titled Changes in Sexual Behavior Following a Sex Education Program in Brazil Public Schools. The essence of this article is that the sexual behaviors among teens is a huge social problem in Brazil, and a lot of the teens are practicing unsafe sexual behaviors with no formal sexual education program instituted. So what they did was implement a program into a couple of the school districts, and then they began asking questions to the students about their sexual behaviors, if they have sex, if they use contraceptives, how many partners they have, etc. And the findings were that out of all the 4,795 respondents, 1,219 of them were engaging in sexual practices before the sexual education program was instituted, and 952 students after. So that's a positive statistic because the amount of sexual behaviors actually went down. However, the negative statistic is that less people began using contraceptives after the program was instituted. This means that while people had less sex, they did practice less safe sex. The conclusion of that program is that it had little impact on sexual behaviors. This was important to my study because it shows a little bit of a background of the impact that sexual education programs can have in public schools, which directly relates to why that question would be asked. Okay, so for week 5, I tested the variable sex education and age using a hypothesis older people oppose sex education in public schools more often than younger people by completing a Pearson's R measure of association test. For this measure of association, the approximate significance was 0.000, which essentially means that there is very little significance between the two variables, and if you change one variable, the other variable is not going to be affected. That means that sex education and age were not strongly correlated. So for week 6, I decided to change my independent variable, since I did learn in week 5 that sex education and age were not strongly related. So I did change my independent variable to teen sex, as you can see in Table 8. That's the question asked in the response choices that were available based off of the 2012 GSS. During this week, I used a 5-step hypothesis process to determine the significance. I did use a paired t-test as well. Paired samples t-test, my apologies. So my hypothesis was those who favor sex education in public schools believe that teen sex is sometimes wrong. And my null hypothesis was favorability of sex education does not influence if teen sex is always wrong, sometimes wrong, or not wrong at all. For this test, I used a 99% confidence level, which makes the significance level 0.01. The p-value was 0.000, making my null hypothesis rejected and my hypothesis true because it is less than the significance level of 0.01. For the purpose of my research study, this meant that there is a significance between the variable sex education and teen sex, making my hypothesis true and my null hypothesis rejected. Essentially, this means that both variables are significantly correlated to each other. Finally, for week 7, the last statistical analysis portion, I ran a multiple linear regression test to predict the value of my dependent variable sex education. For the purpose of this test, I created 2 dummy variables based off of the variables sex and race. To create the dummy variables, I transformed sex and race into male and white. As you can see in Table 10, the male dummy variable, the 2 response choices were either male or not male. In the white dummy variable, the responses were either white or not white. So, I ran the multiple linear regression test based on the hypothesis race and gender is significantly correlated to the favorability of sex education in public schools. And my null hypothesis was race and gender are not significantly correlated to the favorability of sex education in public schools. Before running the test, I used a 95% confidence level, which made the significant level a 0.05. So based off of that, and looking at the ANOVA table and the coefficients table, I did learn that the variables are not correlated to each other. This is because they are greater than 0.05. In the ANOVA test, the significance level is 0.318. The male dummy variable is 0.263, and the white dummy variable is 0.325. This means that the null hypothesis cannot be rejected based off of the individual significance level or the combined significance level in the ANOVA test. Essentially, based off of all of the tests that I ran throughout my entire study, sex education does not have a highly significant relationship with any of the independent variables that I used aside from teen sex. This means that age, race, and gender do not change the outcome of the dependent variable confirmed by 7 weeks of statistical testing. However, the favorability of sex education in public schools and the belief that teen sex between ages 14 to 16 is sometimes wrong are significantly correlated. In conclusion, that is my 7-week portfolio. I hope you enjoyed.